Committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. As a reminder, members participating in a hearing remotely should be visible on camera throughout the hearing. Members are responsible for controlling their own microphones and can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. As a reminder, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository to sccc.repository@mail.house.gov. Finally, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please inform the committee staff immediately. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining this hybrid hearing. A big climate deal, lowering costs, creating jobs, and reducing pollution with the Inflation Reduction Act. We're going to talk today about how the Inflation Reduction Act will help families lower electric and fuel bills, create jobs, and expand investments in U.S. manufacturing, clean energy, clean vehicles, and climate solutions. I'll recognize myself right now for a shorter opening statement. I'm going to submit my full statement into the record. Welcome again, everyone. The Inflation Reduction Act is a cost cutter. Puts money back into the pockets of Americans by making the largest investment in clean energy and energy efficiency in the nation's history. And it's more poignant today that action to address the climate crisis, that we act urgently. And I want to thank everyone who has relayed their concerns for my Florida neighbors in the path of that monster Hurricane Ian, to the ranking member, especially for his outreach. Rep. Graves, I truly appreciate you offering your advice and counsel, because the folks in Louisiana certainly have too much experience at that as well. And as the devastation unfolds, we really owe it to the hardworking people across America to reduce the risks and costs of climate-fueled disasters, whether they're these juiced-up hurricanes or the scorching heat or drought or wildfires. And that's why the Inflation Reduction Act is so important. It will put the United States on a path to reduce our heat-trapping pollution by roughly 40% by 2030. And it will strengthen our energy security, lower costs for Americans, and create millions of jobs. By reducing our reliance on expensive and volatile fossil fuels, the Inflation Reduction Act will allow more Americans to enjoy the cost-saving benefits of renewables like wind and solar, which are now the cheapest sources of power, more money for energy efficiency to also save them money, make it cheaper for them to electrify their homes, and make energy in their appliances more energy efficient. And those who buy electric vehicles will get thousands off the sticker price. And those EVs can save you about $500 a year on fuel cost alone. According to the Blue-Green Alliance, the new law will also help create more than 9 million good jobs over the next decade. That includes 150,000 jobs expanding environmental justice, which means deploying clean buses and garbage trucks in areas of poor air quality, and building new solar and wind projects in working-class communities and on tribal lands. The Inflation Reduction Act is an enormous step forward, and but we know there is more yet to do. So we have some outstanding witnesses here today to help us talk about implementation and how we get those dollars back into the pockets of our neighbors. So I look forward to today's discussion, and I'll yield back my time and recognize Rep. Graves, the ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, thank you for holding this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses and thank you for your flexibility as well. I know we're shifting times a little bit. Madam Chair, I do want to just offer our prayers and support to your constituents and the residents of your state. I wouldn't wish a hurricane on anyone, and watching this one bearing down in your state, and one of the worst trajectories you could probably have going along that west coast with the strong side up against the coast of that state. I am very, very sorry for what you and your other congressional delegation members and citizens of Florida are going through, and just know that that we're here to offer whatever support we can to you and to fellow Floridians in the response and recovery phase. Madam Chair, the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'm going to give a peek to Mr. Rossetti's testimony because I had a chance to to look at it a little bit. One thing that's noteworthy in the testimony is that according to his projections, approximately 2/3 of the emissions reductions, I'll say this slowly and carefully, approximately 2/3 of the emissions reductions that are going to be, that are, I guess, being taken credit for under the Inflation Reduction Act would have happened had that act not been passed. So we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars being spent on projects that were already going to happen. Look, we've been clear in this committee. I think the chair and I share the objective of a trajectory that is lower emissions, that is a more diverse, cleaner energy portfolio, but making sure, from my perspective, making sure that we do so in a way that is based on U.S. resources, that is efficient, that continues the trajectory of downward emissions in a way that looks globally. As the United States has led the world in reducing emissions, China's increased 4 tons for every 1 ton we've reduced. That doesn't affect the United States. It doesn't benefit the United States. I quickly want to say in regard to hurricanes, because we need to make sure that we're staying factual here. Number one, virtually every study, including the journal Nature Climate Change, has found that there's been a 13% reduction in hurricanes. 13% reduction in hurricanes this century. And number two, there have been some studies that have shown increased intensification of hurricanes, while a lower number increased intensification. Got it. One study that recently came out from NOAA indicated that part of the intensification could be tied to the fact that we actually have cleaner air today, lower particulate matter, which was reflecting the energy backup, and therefore we now have warmer Gulf of Mexico and other areas that are resulting in higher or faster intensification of hurricanes. So I think it's really important that any solutions we focus on are truly based in science and data. Madam Chair, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. I apologize, as I mentioned to you earlier, I do have to take off for a few other meetings, but yield back and look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Thank you very much. Now I want to welcome our witnesses. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for moving up the schedule a little bit. Dr. Quinta Warren is the Associate Director of Sustainability Policy at Consumer Reports, where she helps develop winning strategies to address the impacts inequities of the climate crisis and local air pollution, and to build a more sustainable future for consumers. Previously, Dr. Warren founded Energy Research Consulting and also served as a fellow at the Department of Energy. Philip Rossetti is the Senior Fellow for Energy and Environment at the R Street Institute, where he conducts research on energy, climate, and environmental policy. Mr. Rossetti previously served as a fellow on the minority staff of our committee, so welcome back to him. Josh Nasser is the Legislative Director of the International Union of United Automobile, Aerospace, and Agricultural Implement Workers of the UAW. He leads the team responsible for implementing the union's policy agenda, as well as designing legislative strategy on labor, trade, environment, healthcare, defense, energy, tax, and other issues. Welcome. And finally, Samantha Sloan of First Solar was one of our scheduled witnesses. She was not able to join us in person today due to a family emergency, so we're sorry to miss her. But I ask unanimous consent that Ms. Sloan's testimony be added to the hearing record, and hearing no objection, so ordered. So without objection, the witness's written testimony will be made part of this record. And with that, Dr. Warren, you are recognized for 5 minutes to present your testimony. Welcome.
My name is Dr. Quinta Warren, and I'm the Associate Director of Sustainability Policy at Consumer Reports. Thank you, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis for inviting Consumer Reports to testify today. Consumer Reports is supportive of the Inflation Reduction Act because it helps more consumers than any vehicle tax credit in history, saving them fueling and energy costs, reducing public and consumer costs tied to air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, and ensuring overburdened communities can have access to clean technologies. Consumer Reports is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization founded in 1936. Our mission is to help create a fair, safe, and just marketplace for all consumers. We test and rate thousands of products and services, and we advocate for consumer laws and policies. One of the things that Consumer Reports is best known for is testing cars, Every year, our testers drive about 500,000 miles to put new cars through their paces. And we work with policymakers like you to advance policies for safer and cleaner cars. Our analysis show that consumers can save a lot of money by using cleaner technology. And our surveys and analyses also show that the majority of consumers want them, but there are barriers preventing them from purchasing and owning these technologies. Early this year, we conducted our largest ever nationally representative consumer survey on battery electric vehicles and low carbon fuels. We found that 71% of Americans express some level of interest in buying or leasing an electric vehicle or EV. Within that, 14% would definitely buy or lease an EV today. That's more than triple the number from 2020. And this strong interest crosses racial and ethnic groups, where people see EVs as saving money on fuel and maintenance costs. And they are right. Our own analysis shows that owning and maintaining an EV saves $6,000 to $10,000 over the life of the vehicle compared to a comparable gas car. But there are still barriers standing in their way, including costs associated with buying an EV. The IRA helps tackle this barrier through purchase incentives for both new and used EVs. The expanded tax credits in the IRA directly address the upfront cost problem, encouraging every car company to offer more EV models and giving consumers expanded clean vehicle options for decades to come. Just as important is the used EV tax credit that will directly help the overwhelming majority of consumers who buy their cars used. This credit will be especially helpful for low-income communities, which are disproportionately impacted by air pollution and climate change, and are often frozen out of the new car market, due in large part to redlining and other discriminatory policies. Having EV tax credits go directly to dealerships will ensure greater accessibility to the tax credit for low-income consumers who do not have the tax liability to benefit from the entirety of the tax credit themselves. EVs are a fantastic money-saving technology, but our economy will also need other ways to cut greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles. For example, 2/3 of Americans would fill up their tanks on liquid low-carbon fuels, made from sustainable biomass, for example, if they did not have to ship the kind of vehicle they used and it did not have an additional cost. And 62% would be likely to choose a flight that ran on a similar fuel, assuming there's no cost premium. The vehicle purchase incentives in the IRA for fuel cell vehicles and tax credits for sustainable aviation fuel will go a long way to ensure that consumers have options for low-carbon fuel vehicles, as will the research funds for analysis of the impacts of fuel on the environment and public health. Of course, the IRA also delivers more money-saving benefits for American homes, especially for low-income households, which spend a larger share of their income on energy costs. In summary, cleaner technologies save consumers money on fuel and electricity and maintenance costs. However, upfront purchase costs prevent consumers from buying and owning these technologies. We applaud the Inflation Reduction Act, as the incentives therein will help to ensure that consumers can save money and cut down on the many costs tied to air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And this is particularly important for low-income consumers who have too often been left out of the transition to cleaner and more money-saving technologies. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much. Next, Mr. Rossetti, you're up. You're recognized for 5 minutes to present your testimony. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairwoman Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and honorable members of the committee for inviting me to testify on the Inflation Reduction Act today. I want to cover 3 key points about the Inflation Reduction Act. One is the overall potential environmental impact of the legislation. 2 are the barriers to actually achieving that outcome. And 3 is the overall economic impact as the incidence of subsidies are going to have to be paid for by taxes elsewhere in the economy and what effect this might have. So overall, in the environmental impact, at R Street, we took a look at the total estimated cost of the IRA and just took at honest value the CBO's estimate and said, okay, if this is true, how much clean energy can this buy, and compare that to the Energy Information Administration's projected baseline. And looking at that, the sheer volume subsidy, which is hundreds of billions of dollars, does result in an increase in purchases. And we would expect about a 37% increase in clean electricity production over the baseline and some modest effects in the transportation sector. with overall a potential of about 12% emission reduction relative to 2005 levels, which is pretty consistent with the Rhodium group that estimate about 8 to 12% in other studies. The caveat to this, though, is the low cost of renewables and high investment potential already means that most of this technology would have already been deployed irrespective of the IRA. So we estimate about 67% of the clean electricity subsidies will go to clean energy production that would have occurred even absent the IRA. Similarly, with the EV tax credits, we do see a huge increase we see a large amount of the subsidies go to EVs that probably would have been deployed anyway, as the AI expects close to 6 million new EVs being deployed, and the tax credits support about 1 million new EVs. In this environment, we expect that the additionality of these subsidies and the potential environmental benefit is mitigated by the fact that most of the money would go to efforts that would already occur without the IRA. In terms of actually getting to that potential 12% emission reduction, it's largely locked behind regulatory factors. Increasingly, we're hearing from the clean energy space that they're facing regulatory barriers rather than cost barriers to new deployment. So there's close to 1,000 gigawatts of low carbon electricity in interconnection queues in the United States right now. The interconnection queue timelines have gone from about 2 years to close to 4 years. And we hear from some developers that it can even be about 8 years in some areas. The transmission adequacy is not really good. The transmission congestion costs and many of the interconnections are increasing, sometimes by multiple times. We also have increasing curtailment in the renewable space. So a lot of areas are already saturated with new renewables, and deploying more renewables means that there's a diminishing return. So without that increased transmission and availability to actually get new clean energy to where it needs to go, you're not going to get environmental benefit. And the REPEAT project, which is probably one of the most optimistic estimates of the IRA's effects, that estimated that about 80% of their emission potential is locked behind transmission growth. So actually getting to this environmental outcome requires structural changes in regulatory policy. Especially on the permitting, it's been very interesting. At R Street, we looked at the DOE and BLM's permitting for clean energy, and we noted that about 42% of DOE's projects were related to clean energy, conservation, transmission, only 15% were fossil fuel. Similar ratios in BLM. And just looking at the federal permitting dashboard today, 65% of the energy projects are renewable projects. So addressing these issues are key to clean energy growth and are largely absent from the IRA. Additionally, it's important to consider the full economic impacts of any legislation. Every dollar that is going to be spent on subsidy by the US government is going to result in $1 of tax somewhere else. So who's going to pay that tax is largely going to determine the overall economic impact of any legislation. So when it comes to the IRA, where we know that a huge portion of it is going to be from corporate taxes, we also have to ask, okay, who's going to be paying those taxes? The CBO notes that higher corporate rates are going to overall reduce the incentives to invest in the United States, are going to have negative economic effects. The Tax Foundation, similarly, in looking at the IRA, estimates about a 0.2% lower GDP in the long run and lower long run incomes across the board for Americans. There are some positive effects of the IRA, namely the deficit reduction, and these can offset to a certain degree the negative impacts of the tax increases. But overall, when we look at the studies, it generally shows about a wash. So with that, it's important to consider that what are we getting, how much is it going to cost, and who's going to pay for it? And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rossetti. Next up, Mr. Nasser, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairwoman Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and member of the Select Committee. On behalf of the 1 million members and retirees of United Auto Workers, our President, Ray Curry, the Executive Board, just want to thank you for this opportunity to share our views on the Inflation Reduction Act and express what an honor it is to talk to before this committee today. The work of this committee is extremely important in our view. So the Inflation Reduction Act is an unambiguous win for working people, in our view, and here's why. Number one, it deals with what's actually, putting a pinch on people's wallets and pocketbooks, which is, a big thing is the high cost of prescription drugs, which in the United States is often, 4 times or more than other countries. And remember, as taxpayers, we subsidize a lot of the research for pharmaceutical drugs as well. But not just that, the energy. By having a diversity of sources, it will lead to lower costs for people, over time. But we look at Inflation Reduction Act in tandem with the bipartisan infrastructure law, CHIPS, and Recovery Act, and it's a very productive Congress. Those are 4 very important laws, and they work together. And I'll be happy to get into that more. But I just want a couple of things that I just want to make sure to set the record straight on. One is on the taxes. So this bill is paid for by having enforcement on the richest folks, IRS. And, it's been estimated over, $160 billion a year from the top 1% are not paid in taxes. So it's really a focus up there, which makes a lot of sense. And then the other thing is having this corporate minimum tax, which, right now, that by not having a minimum, we basically are, creating an environment where there's a premium for kind of exporting jobs and actually becomes some incentive. So it actually is good for workers, and also just the corporate share of tax receipts has dropped precipitously over time. So this kind of makes things a little more equal, a little more paying their fair share. As far as the inflation, as far as inflation itself, we auto workers, have suffered greatly because of, for example, the chip shortage. Well, why was there a chip shortage? Because of the pandemic. The pandemic is the root cause of all the chaos with the supply chains, and is really can be traced back to why a big reason why inflation. But the truth is that inflation is for many, many factors. It's not just one thing. But we know this much. The costs of prescription drugs, the costs of energy are really, hurting people, and this directly addresses those major cost factors. The other thing that I want to talk about is what it does actually for manufacturing. We've lacked manufacturing policy for a long time in this country. And the truth is that China and all those other countries that are deploying EVs, a lot of them are really far advanced, and they've been supporting those industries and those investments for a long time. So we've been competing with one arm tied behind our back. And now one might say, well, why should we care? Well, the reality is that EVs are here, and they're global, and they're going to become a larger percentage. So people are going to be driving EVs more over time. The question for us is, where are they going to be built? We want them to be built in the United States, and we want them to be supporting good union jobs. So that's our view on that. And what it does is between ATVM, the various tax programs that are here, the conversion grants, et cetera, what it does is it will enable factories to change over to be able to build electric vehicles. It'll also allow a lot more of the battery supply, battery manufacturing to be here, where we're way behind. And we think that the entire supply chain, should be in the U.S., that we should be able to dominate this just like we used to dominate auto manufacturing. Now, are they going to be good jobs all created from here? That is something that's to be determined in auto, because what we have to see is, are workers going to have a choice to collectively bargain or not? A lot of automakers go through great lengths to fight against workers having that choice. So what's going to happen there? We're also seeing a lot of companies who are automakers teaming up with battery manufacturers and creating joint ventures. And what kind of jobs are those going to provide? We think they should be good union auto jobs because they're about moving the car forward. This is, and the other thing I'll say is just, this will speed up the transition to EVs, and these are investments that were badly, badly needed. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to our witnesses for their informative testimony. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes to start the questions. Thank you all for weighing in on how the Inflation Reduction Act is a win-win-win. It's a win for American families, it's a win for workers, it's a win for businesses across this country. It really puts us in a, as Mr. Nassar pointed out, a great competitive, here in the global competition for who is going to make these technologies and how we expand them across the world. It is on. That competition is on, and It's America that should be in the lead on all these, and it's our families and our workers that should benefit. But I want to take us kind of out of the Washington, D.C. committee room and take us to the kitchen tables of families across the country that have been grappling with higher cost and try to make this real for them because they hear Inflation Reduction Act. They may have heard, okay, this has a clean energy and climate piece, but what does this really mean for families? And Consumer Reports, Ms. Warren, is a trusted source for consumers across the country. We see rebates and discounts for all sorts of, not just electric vehicles, but appliances, air conditioning, heat pumps, insulating your homes. How can we get the information out? How can you help us, and how can other organizations help us get that information into the hands of families who really need it? They're hungry for ways to save money right now. What's your advice?
Thank you, Chair Castor, for the question. Yes, the IRA has a lot of good benefits for consumers. As you mentioned, energy costs can be high, especially for low-income consumers for whom the spend on energy is the highest. This bill offsets the cost of more efficient appliances, allows them to weatherize their homes, and allows them to save costs over time on vehicles, appliances, and so on. I think everybody would agree that switching to more efficient appliances is a good thing, and I think consumers already know that, and they're clamoring for these clean technologies. It's a matter of creating awareness, and that's part of what we do as Consumer Reports. For example, we have information and buying tools on our website. One of those is directly tied to electric vehicles. We're actually, people can go in and put in their location information, and EV incentives will come back out specific to where they are and their income and so on. And we plan to update that tool once the IRA is also implemented so that people know what the new benefits are to them. So as Consumer Reports, we certainly can do our part in just educating people on how they can take advantage of these incentives once they're implemented.
I think that's going to be so important. One good website that I've come across is rewiringamerica.org, where what you said, you know, some of these are location-based. You can put in your zip code, and the discounts and rebates and tax credits come up. Some of these are available now, and we're talking about clothes dryers. If you're going to replace your air conditioner, getting more efficient fuel pump and save money at the same time. Just insulating your home, things like even the electric panel the electrical panel in your home. These are going to be available to you, and I appreciate you pointing out that the Inflation Reduction Act is really targeted at working class, middle class families. If you are a millionaire or a billionaire, you do not qualify for any of. You cannot use this to help you save money on your next model Tesla. These are targeted to working families, middle class families. There are some income limits, and it has the potential to create millions of good paying jobs. Mr. Nasser, it's hard to keep up now with the announcements from car manufacturers, battery plants now on their new factories and plants. What are you watching right now, and how can we keep up with the job opportunities that'll be available?
I think it's, thank you for the question. I think it's really going to be important to watch the decisions very closely made by companies as far as what are they going to do as far as their workforce. You know, are they going to make sure that they actually have a choice whether to join a union or not, or are they going to fight it? Are they going to, pay below manufacturing wages or not? And I think that the Congress and the administration really need to put a spotlight on
Well, and the
that
incentives are tied to it. There's more money back into people's pockets when they
Exactly.
purchase an EV if it's made in America, the component parts are made in America, and we do it with union labor. Is that right?
The provisions were changed a bit in the Senate. The House version was completely the House version. The EV tax credit is what's really good about it is right now there were several companies that weren't able to offer it all, like GM. And now the cap has been lifted, so that should
Good,
enable
we'll get
some more
into it a
union
little
built
bit more.
cars to get out.
I'm over time, we'll get into that a little bit more. But at this time, we'll recognize Ms. Miller for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Castor, and thank you all for joining us today. One of the most wonderful things about America, it is made up of many, many people with many, many opinions. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. Every economist worth their salt has concluded that this legislation would do the exact opposite. It will make inflation worse. It will punish working-class Americans, and it will make America less competitive by chilling innovation. Today, I get to share with my colleagues what damage this bill will really do to our families, our communities, and our country. First of all, it is telling that we are speaking of this bill in this particular committee. This bill does nothing to reduce inflation for working-class Americans, but it does force taxpayers to pony up hundreds of billions of dollars for Green New Deal slush funds that will ultimately do little to nothing to lower global emissions. It will put hardworking American energy workers out of a job and send billions of dollars to the Chinese Communist Party to buy supplies for their boondoggles. The bill also includes a $250 billion slush fund at the Department of Energy to provide taxpayer subsidies for risky renewable technologies that no traditional bank would ever invest in, even with their ESG-centric leadership. The Department of Energy should be laser-focused on lowering the price of energy for the American people and ensuring that our electrical grid is reliable. Instead, Americans this year have faced record-high gas prices when they fill up their tanks, record-high heating prices for their home, and are staring down a cold, dark winter with rolling blackouts and brownouts already common across the country. I am thankful that we still have coal and natural gas to keep our homes powered when renewables cannot possibly fill this need at this time. If this administration had its way, our most reliable baseload energy would be dismantled as well. The attacks on American energy production aren't the only disastrous provisions of this bill. It also increases taxes on American companies who are already grappling with high inflation, further increasing prices, creating fewer jobs, and lowering wages across the board. I look forward to the Republicans taking control of Congress next year to put a stop to this madness being perpetrated by this bill and holding the out-of-control Biden administration accountable and to put Americans back to work. Mr. Rossetti, in your testimony, you state that the impact of this bill will transfer wealth from American taxpayers to subsidized energy companies. Proponents of the bill claim that the most of the taxes raised by the legislation are paid for by wealthy corporations. Can you explain why that is a misleading assumption and who will actually bear the burden of the book minimum tax?
That's an excellent question. So when we think about the effects of the corporate tax, the important thing to keep in mind is at the end of the day, humans are the ones who pay taxes, even corporate taxes. So most people who say that we should do corporate taxes try to say, well, it's the investors of the corporations who bear the tax. And that might have been true in an environment where we had a more closed economy, but now we have a globally competitive economy and corporations have to compete everywhere. So under those conditions, the research increasingly shows that workers and consumers of corporations pay a larger share of the corporate income tax. So the IRA's tax on what they call supernormal returns, which is kind of a more recent term, even that is expected to have about 50% of its costs fall on corporate workers. So when we look at these taxes, we have to understand if investors are able to shift the incidence of the tax onto other entities, we would expect them to do so. And I don't think the IRA is any different in that regard.
So is the taxpayer-funded renewable subsidies the best way to lower global emissions, or would money be better spent more effectively elsewhere?
I would say that's probably not the best policy because one of my concerns with climate change is this is a global challenge. So when I look at this sort of policy of continued indefinite subsidy for renewable energies and other energy priorities, it's communicating to the rest of the world, especially the developing world, where they have far lower incomes relative to Americans, that these technologies are only viable with continued subsidy. And really the key is actually having lower real costs, not lower subsidized costs.
I yield back my time.
Next, Rep. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor, and thank you to the witnesses. And Chair Castor, I just want to also add my thoughts are with your constituents in the state of Florida. I do want to respond to Ranking Member Graves' comment, which I found a bit surprising today about the number of hurricanes decreasing. From what I could tell in my brief research, according to the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, the number of smaller hurricanes has decreased, but the number of major hurricanes has increased. And in fact, even the sources that confirm that the number of hurricanes has decreased, it's true in other ocean basins, but not the North Atlantic. So I just wanted to respond to that comment. I'm tempted to respond to Representative Miller's comments as well, but I want to cheer for the Inflation Reduction Act because it is a significant step moving forward in meeting our goals of a net zero emissions future. We know it's not the only step we need to take. It's anticipated that the Inflation Reduction Act will create about 9 million jobs over the next decade and among other fields. Clean energy, clean transportation, and clean manufacturing. So this means we need to train and onboard new workers through workforce and apprenticeship programs. I want to talk to Mr. Nasser about that. Mr. Nasser, you may know I grew up in the Detroit area. I love Oregon, and I've lived there a very long time, but my childhood was spent in the Detroit area. So I know that U.S. companies are making more electric vehicles. So can you talk a little bit about what's involved in converting the infrastructure for manufacturing and how the Inflation Reduction Act will help? But also I wanted to talk about the workforce issues, both in autos, and I know your union also represents aerospace workers. How will the Inflation Reduction Act help meet these needs? Because, as I mentioned, tremendous number of jobs and new skills are going to be needed, and it's exciting.
Very exciting. Thank you for the question. First of all, if just on the workforce for a second, you know, we through collective bargaining, other unions, we have a very successful apprenticeship programs where people are able to upskill. And I think taking a look at that, having more help for vocational education and building up that part of the workforce more would be helpful, federal policy, but also take a look at what some of the companies and unions are already doing, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel, sort of
Right.
speak.
We're trying to update the National Apprenticeship Act for the first time since the 1930s. We're working on that.
But the other thing is, you know, is talking about the jobs. I mean, the truth is that these are very competitive industries, the manufacturing industries, and if you're not on the cutting edge, if you're not making the new product, you know, you could fall way behind. So there has to be risks taken. First of all, not every idea necessarily pans out, but what's the cost of not doing it? Well, the cost is we're going to continue to have, we'd have a decline in leadership as far as creating the industries of the future. We'd fall further behind on EV production and battery production. And that means ultimately those jobs won't be here.
Right,
So we got to anchor the jobs here. As far as what we could do to make them better jobs, I mean, I would say, you know, the Senate should follow the House's lead and make sure that workers have a voice on the job by passing the PRO Act would be one thing.
I agree with you on that.
And then the other thing I think is just to really you know, have tight scrutiny on the way that companies are using those funds and making sure that it's, you know, as intended.
Great. Well, and I look forward to working with you on that. And of course, the CHIPS and Science Act, as a member of the Science Committee, I know that's going to help greatly because everything has chips in it now. Dr. Warren, thank you for being here. Your testimony, you mentioned that low-income and overburdened communities have historically borne the brunt of the climate crisis, including experiencing more harmful effects from air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. So why does reducing emissions from the transportation sector, which the Inflation Reduction Act does through the investment in zero-emission heavy-duty vehicles, how does that benefit low-income and disadvantaged communities? And also, just to follow up on Chair Castor's question, how can the Inflation Reduction Act help Americans save on energy costs? And I just want to mention that in Oregon, we heard from Sammy Lewis in a roundtable conversation who said that through the programs that Oregon offers through Oregon Energy Trust, she was able to do efficiency upgrades like are anticipated with this bill. And she has a credit on her energy bill right now from doing that. So can you talk about that as well?
Well, that's excellent to hear. Thank you for the question, Representative. So low income and other overburdened communities have borne the brunt because of discriminatory policies that place them more in proximity to high transportation corridors, warehouses, ports, and so on. So they feel the impact of air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions the most. Now, electrifying heavy-duty vehicles means that there will be reduced air pollution in those neighborhoods. And of course, there are other parts of the IRA that are great for them because they get to participate in buying and owning and using clean technologies as well. I'm trying to come back to your second question, but I forgot.
Oh, I was just asking about the energy savings that people will experience
yes.
and what a difference that will make.
Yeah, so more energy efficient appliances obviously means you use less energy, which means that you're saving money. And frankly, again, low-income consumers tend to have a higher energy burden. So this is great for them because they will get to keep more money in their wallets. And similar with electric vehicles, which, as I've said, save something like 60% on fueling costs alone, so that over the life of the vehicle, they will save between $6,000 and $10,000. It's fantastic.
Thank you. And I know I'm out of time, but as I yield back, I just want to mention in regard to transportation that when the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis came to Oregon, both Chair Castor and Representative Carter were able to see our electric island where they recharge school buses made in Georgia and city buses that are electric. I yield back.
All right, next I'll go to Rep. Caston. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks so much to our witnesses. Mr. Rossetti, I'd like to focus on you, and I really want to emphasize the areas that we have a lot that we agree on, but I don't want to presume on what we agree. So let me just start with things that I'm thinking we're on the same page on, but number one, would you agree with me that competition helps lower inflation? Competitive markets make things cheaper.
Well, I'd say supply is probably going to be the key to lowering inflation. Inflation is caused by too many dollars.
I'm just asking a yes or no. Are you pro-market competition as a tool to lower inflation?
Yeah, we're
Okay, terrific. We're on the same page. Do you agree with me that subsidies make markets inefficient?
I would agree that subsidies make markets inefficient.
Terrific. And I know you used to be a Hill lobbyist. Is your experience similar to mine that it's vastly more common that corporations lobby for lower taxes than it is that they come in and lobby for higher minimum wages? Was that your experience?
I've never been a lobbyist, so I can't speak to that.
But you were on the Hill for a while. Surely you ran into some people who were coming and making asks of us.
Well, I know that lobbyists are always going to pursue more.
Do you find that corporate America is regularly asking for higher minimum wages or lower taxes? This is not a trick question.
I'd say that corporations are always going to ask for lower taxes.
Okay,
because
terrific. The reason I established those things we agree on is because competition lowers inflation. The IRA gives consumers choice. If you can't afford a solar panel on your roof, you don't have a choice. We just made that cheaper. If you can't afford to buy an electric vehicle, we just made those things cheaper. Those people who can't afford that, they're buying more expensive gasoline to run their car if they can't afford an electric vehicle. They're buying more expensive energy from their utility. Once they have those solar panels, they run them. Once they have the EVs, they drive them. They are inherently cheaper. The permitting bill that just failed yesterday, why did it fail? Because the regulated electric utility, which does not know what market competition looks like if it bit them in the posterior, lobbied against it to kill it because they can't bear the thought that we might actually get transmission that would bring cleaner, cheaper energy to market. We both hate subsidies. The fossil fuel sector gets $664 billion a year in subsidies, according to the International Monetary Fund. About 10% of that is through direct taxes. I cannot get a single Republican to support the People Over Petroleum Act that me and my colleague, Mr. McEachin, have introduced that would cut those taxes and give $500 back to every American. Because at the end of the day, you all are not pro-market. You are pro-corporate welfare. The third point is you said in your testimony, I'm quoting your written testimony, 50 and 100% of corporate income taxes fall on corporate workers. Are corporations idiots? Or do they actually know that that's not really true? Because if it was, they'd be pushing for higher minimum wages because they're agnostic, right? It's the same as taxes. Now, the truth is the IRA is going to create jobs. It's going to lower energy bills, create energy independence, improve health outcomes. It's an investment in our future. It's going to save the typical household $1,800 a year. That's anti-inflationary. That's less money. But we actually have a lot of stuff that we agree with. We agree that we need transmission reform. We agree on your analysis that there are vastly more barriers to deploying clean energy than there are to fossil energy. Your own analysis says that the fossil fuel projects are basically doing fine. not surprisingly, because they're so heavily subsidized. We agree that we should get rid of all these distorting market subsidies, especially the biggest ones in the fossil fuel sector. But to do that, we need policy reform, not just spending. And in order to make those policy reforms, we either need to get rid of the filibuster in the Senate, because we all know the reason why we had to do this through reconciliation was because of Senate procedural rules, or we need a Republican Party that is committed to competitive markets, that is committed to the idea that if you give consumers choice to have cheaper energy, that is the best outcome, that is committed to the idea that science matters, not just crony capitalism. And we are here in this moment. I sit on the Financial Services Committee. We had a whole long conversation with the big banks last week about woke capitalism. Exxon is trading at a 10 times multiple on earnings. Tesla is trading at 100. Capital markets are 10 times more desirous of putting their hard-earned dollars into companies that are providing things that people want. Shell's trading at a 7 times multiple on earnings. First Solar's trading at about 70. Again, 10 times factor. Capital markets choosing to invest in people who are giving things what people want, in spite of all those subsidies, is not woke capitalism, it's capitalism. Let's embrace it, let's move forward, let's be responsible, let's recognize the areas where we have an agreement, and not get into the silly polemicism, because we do not have time to sit around here in rhetorical gymnastics that are basically just lies. Thank you, and I yield back.
Next up, Mr. Carter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all the witnesses for being here today. I want to start with you, Mr. Rossetti. I appreciate you being here, albeit virtually. The many things that I have concerns about in the IRA and the Inflation Reduction Act, the electric vehicle subsidies are a big concern of mine and to my district, and I'll explain the reason for that. Setting aside the issue of the actual emission impacts of EVs, I'm concerned about the actual policy we rushed into law. If you will remember, the Inflation Reduction Act did not go through regular order. It didn't go through the committee process. It went straight to the floor. And there's a problem with that. Also, as you're aware, the law expands EV tax credit incentives, but also puts in place new requirements for manufacturing those vehicles and batteries in the United States. The goal of this is to bring more manufacturing in the U.S. We all agree with that. Republicans, Democrats, we all want more manufacturing in the U.S. We all agree with that. Unfortunately, a major company, Hyundai announced in my district the largest economic development project in the history of our state. They announced that they were going to be building an electric vehicle plant that's going to be a $5.5 billion investment in the 1st Congressional District of Georgia. It's going to create 8,100 jobs. And that's just their plant. It is not the subsidies and the other companies that are going to be there as well. They expect for subsidiary companies to invest another $1 billion for a total of about $6.5 billion investment right there in the 1st Congressional District of Georgia. 8,100 jobs, plus the other jobs that are coming about as a result of the ancillary jobs that will be affiliated with the other companies that come there. But now it's all at risk. All of it's in jeopardy. The largest investment in the history of the state of Georgia in jeopardy because of the Inflation Reduction Act. And let me tell you why. It says that Hyundai will not be able to qualify for these credits because they won't have their plant built for 18 to 24 months from now. So they're not going to be able to participate in these EV tax credits. They are considering withdrawing that. Now, a couple of things I want to point out. This is egregious in the sense that we did not go through regular order. You know, none of us is as smart as all of us. If it had gone through regular order, perhaps we could have realized what was going on here. We could have vetted it and understood that this was a problem. But more so than anything, the President of the United States was in South Korea the week before and assured the leaders of this company that they would be taken care of in the Inflation Reduction Act. And then they go and announce it, and the following week, 2 weeks from when he had been in South Korea, This Inflation Reduction Act is introduced and passed, rammed through without regular order, and all of a sudden, that promise that was made to them, they find out they're not going to be eligible for this. Let me ask you something, Mr. Rossetti. Most electric vehicle models on the market today won't qualify for this EV tax credit. Is that your understanding of that?
That is my understanding. The narrower constraint of the new EV tax credit is going to mitigate the eligibility across existing EV producers.
Is that going to result in more EVs on the road?
Well, according to the estimates of the new EV tax credit, which we show would only support about 1 million EVs, that's far lower than the projected uptake even without the IRA. So I don't see that specific tax credit as having a huge benefit to new EV market uptake.
The EV tax credits that are in the Inflation Reduction Act, who do they, that are written in law, who benefits from them?
That's a great question. So when we think about the tax credits for new EVs, that's obviously going to benefit people who are buying new EVs. But I'm also a bit skeptical of the used EV tax credit because the expectation is that people who are buying used vehicles would benefit the most from having their purchasing power increased. But we'd also expect people who already have EVs that are going to sell them would do so anyway. So they might be able to charge a higher price because of the used EV tax credit, which might actually inadvertently benefit people who already own EVs. And are
Well, I'm about out of time. I thank you for your answers, but again, I want to reiterate the largest investment in the history of the state of Georgia in jeopardy because this bill was rammed through. It didn't go through regular order. It wasn't vetted like it should have been because promises were made to these people that weren't kept. And now it's in jeopardy. Thank God we're the #1 forestry state in the nation and we can afford this. Thank you. I yield back.
Next up, Representative Escobar, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And I think it's really important first to recognize what's happening in your state, Florida, and to tell you just how much I know others have been keeping Floridians in our prayers. Just seeing the devastation that families are living through has been so heartbreaking. And to see really kind of the irony of it is here we are talking about the Inflation Reduction Act and all of the benefits that can and will come from this historic piece of legislation, while at the same time, on TV screens across America, we're witnessing the devastation happening in Florida as a result of the climate catastrophe. And the fact of the matter is, and the tragic reality is, we have taken far too long to act. And for decades, we have heard from people who were either climate deniers or who loved to list all of the obstacles or any potential downsides to investment in order to address the climate crisis, instead of all of us being on the same page about solutions. And I have to agree with my colleague, Mr. Kasten, who said that we had to pass the climate action legislation through reconciliation without a single Republican vote, because tragically, too many of our Republican colleagues either want to obstruct progress on this or deny that this is a challenge altogether. And so, while I am very excited about the investments in the Inflation Reduction Act, I am also very cognizant of the fact that we are acting decades too late. I've said this before, you can't unmelt an ice cap. And so we're going to have to do the best we can as quickly as we can in order to make sure that those dollars go out the door and are as effective as they can be. I'd like to start with a question with Dr. Warren and to all of our panelists. Thank you all for testifying today. Thank you for taking time to have this really important conversation. Dr. Warren, I represent the community of El Paso, Texas, which is an economically disadvantaged, mostly Latino community on the US-Mexico border. And we have seen the impact of severe drought in our community, followed by historic rainfall that leads to flooding and that leads to complete topsoil erosion, destruction of infrastructure. So we've been having to balance both of those things. But I will tell you, I have a community eager to lean in on addressing the climate crisis and also taking advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act. And our chairwoman kind of mentioned this in her questions and her comments as well, wanting to make sure that communities understand how to access those funds. But my particular interest is underserved communities and making sure that we get as much information and get those dollars directly to them. And so I'd love for you to highlight for us how underserved communities can benefit from these incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act, please.
Thank you for the question, Representative. I was going to say I am sorry for the things that your community is going through. That's really where I wanted to start. In terms of how they can take it or how they can benefit from these incentives, again, these clean technologies are actually good for consumers because they cut down on operating costs. They cut down on energy costs, which communities exactly like the one you're describing will benefit from. So that'll save them money that they can keep in their wallets. The problem has been that they generally cannot afford these technologies. So the IRA comes in and actually brings down these purchase costs and allows them to be a part of this clean energy transition. In terms of vehicles, the fact that we have used EV credits is a huge thing. This is the first time that tax credits can be used for the secondary car market, and communities like this generally buy their vehicles in the secondary car market. So once again, this gives them the opportunity to participate. They can transfer those credits to dealerships, which will allow them to actually take advantage of the full incentive rather than just what would be limited to their tax liability. So even besides cars, in the homes as well, they can reduce the cost of energy efficient appliances and they can weatherize their homes. All of that leads to lower energy spend and energy costs, which allows them to save money that, once again, they can keep in their wallets. Thank you.
Dr. Warren, thank you so much for your work. And you're right, the secondary car market is going to be huge. And we've got to make sure that our communities, especially communities in need like mine, stand ready to take advantage. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. I'm out of time. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next up, Mr. Palmer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Find my talk button. Thanks. And Chair Castor, I'm glad to know that your family and community were spared, and we do continue to monitor what's going on in Florida, and I know all of us are committed to helping any way we can. I do want to talk about what you call the Inflation Reduction Act. I call it the Income Reduction Act. We're talking with economists, including left of center economists that were in the Obama administration that believe that this is going to make inflation worse. And we've been following this very closely. The more money you pour into the market, the worse it makes inflation. But when you add to that these, I think, very devastatingly damaging energy policies that are being implemented by the Biden administration and supported by the Democrats in Congress, it's going to make life even harder for American families. We're in a cost of living crisis. We're not only seeing the price of goods and services go up, food, just basic living items. There are 20 million Americans that are already behind on their utility bills, and it's going to get even worse this winter. I'm very concerned about the number of excess winter deaths that we will see as results of people not being able to keep their homes adequately warmed and still be able to afford their food and medicine. We've seen the impact that the passage of this bill had on the stock market, and there are families, millions of families all over the country that had invested in the market with the hopes of using the returns from those investments to pay for their kids' college. They're not planning on getting the government to pay for their kids' college. They're going to pay for it. You've got families that, where people in their late 50s, early 60s planning to retire, they can't do that now. You've got retirees that are needing to find another job because their investments are not keeping up with inflation, and then looking at what's happening to the market. And it was actually predicted that if we passed another stimulus bill like the Income Reduction Act, that it would result in the Dow going below 30,000. They actually predicted 29,500 and almost hit it spot on. And I know, my Democrat colleagues like to claim that we're climate deniers. That couldn't be further from the truth. We understand climate, and having worked in engineering, as I've said many times, I understand what it takes to build out the infrastructure that you have to go to a lower carbon emissions. This idea that you're going to go to zero carbon emissions in the near future is a pipe dream. It's not possible from an engineering side, and it's only going to make things worse. And I'm very concerned about how this is impacting people. This idea that this is one of the lowest hurricane instances of hurricanes in a hurricane season in a long time. We went one 12-year period where we didn't have really any significant hurricanes. But even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change admits that there's no consensus that man-made activities or climate change have any impact on the number, frequency, or intensity of hurricanes. This is what you get when you live on the Gulf Coast. You have hurricanes. We've had them for years. The interesting thing is that since 1900, in terms of the loss of life attributed to natural catastrophes, there's been a 98% reduction. A lot of that has to do with the fact that we've learned how to prepare for these natural disasters and mitigate against them. And that's what we ought to be doing in preparation for the climate change that's coming that we can't do anything about. I hear misrepresentations about the history of drought, as though drought's a new thing in the southwestern part of the United States. I first would remind my colleagues that that is a desert, arid region. It's an arid region. There's enormous numbers of people living there relative to what there have been in the past, so it creates a tremendous demand for water. But we've had droughts in the southwestern United States that lasted 50 to 100 years, 1,000 years ago. So we've got to get back not only to the science of climate change, but also to the history of climate change. If we want to have any impact that truly helps people, and throwing more money at it is not the answer. And we're going to face a time when we literally have blackouts in the Midwest because they've changed the energy mix that provides the power to our grid. And with that, Madam Chairman, again, I am very concerned about what's going on in Florida for family and friends down there. And if we can be of any help, let us know. I yield back.
Thank you. Next up, Ranking Member Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, thanks again for the hearing. I want to thank you all for being here, and I apologize I had to take off. I understand that there was maybe a little bit of an unpleasant dialogue earlier, and I'm very sorry that I missed it, but I want to make note that that is the second time in 2 weeks that there has been a member of, in this case, this committee, and the same member on another committee that attacked a witness that they didn't agree with. Last week, it was Michael Schellenberger, and I think that it was attacking the witness because they didn't agree. And disagreeing is fine, but if we're going to truly address climate change, we've got to stay focused on emissions. We've got to stay focused on emissions. I think there are three things that we've got to stay focused on. I think it's the affordability of energy, I think it's energy security in regard to the supply chain, and it's the emissions. I want to remind y'all, as the United States has led the world in reducing emissions, for every 1 ton of emissions we've reduced, China's increased by 4. China's increased by 4 for every 1 ton of emissions we've reduced. It is infuriating to sit here and watch us continue to get on this path where right now the United States emissions are actually increasing. You don't read in the press, U.S. emissions are increasing right now. The Inflation Reduction Act, as I noted earlier in quoting Mr. Rossetti's testimony, projected that 2/3 of the emissions reduction under that legislation are already going to happen. Mr. Caston made note in his comments earlier about how the economics are being distorted or volatility or whatever. Look, if you want to talk about volatility or distorting economics, it is by stepping in and making things distorting or making economics perverse in a way that there's not a path to economic sustainability. We always talk about environmental sustainability. What happens when subsidies dry up, when they phase out? If these projects aren't on a path to economic sustainability, that causes volatility. By making or distorting economics in a way that makes people invest in projects or technologies that aren't economically sustainable, that just doesn't make sense. We're creating the volatility by not thinking about an economically sustainable glide path for some of these technologies. Mr. Rossetti, I understand that you took some lumps earlier in regard to some of your statements on the IRA. I wanted to give you a chance to clarify some of your remarks.
Sure. One thing that I thought was a little interesting was Representative Caston, I think, correctly pointed out that subsidies do distort markets and actually reduce competition and therefore make things more expensive in the long run, yet then defended the extremely large subsidies in the IRA. It seems to be contradictory. But one thing I also think is important to note is the IMF is frequently cited for its estimate of fossil fuel subsidies, but that estimate is almost entirely contingent upon an estimate that if carbon is not taxed, that therefore that equates to a subsidy, which is kind of similar logic to saying that you're robbing or subsidizing your local bank by not robbing it. If the Democrats wanted to implement a carbon tax to address that, if they truly believe that, then they certainly could have under budget reconciliation provisions.
Thank you, Mr. Rossetti. Mr. Rossetti, are you a lobbyist?
Absolutely not.
And are you advocating for solutions that are economically sustainable?
Economically sustainable climate solutions are key to actually bring down global emissions. You look at where emissions are growing, it's developing nations. So if you want something that's going to help us in the long term, especially address these impacts that many are so concerned about, you need to have technology that's low in cost, exportable, and going to be deployable in communities that might have a fifth or less of the income of a typical American household.
Madam Chair, I think the point Mr. Rossetti just made is absolutely key, that ensuring that the technologies that the federal government is involved in, that there is a path to economic sustainability, because that is the only way that you achieve a path to environmental sustainability. And otherwise, you're creating the volatility. And I think Mr. Rossetti just made the point that the government's actions right now, we're seeing higher emissions. As I noted in my opening statement, we're seeing 1/4 of all Americans unable to afford food, medicine, or energy. And we're seeing greater energy insecurity. And that even Secretary Blinken just this week went to other countries asking them for critical mineral supplies that we have right here in the United States. So I think, again, we share objectives in regard to lower emissions and a sustainable trajectory, but I think maybe a different pathway of getting there would make a lot more sense. Yield back.
All right, next up, Mr. Crenshaw, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for holding this hearing and allowing us to disagree on whether or not this is good for America or bad for America, and certainly answer the question about whether it's good for inflation. Although I did know and notice that in the final hours of passing this bill, everyone basically agreed that this was not about reducing inflation, and instead it began being branded as a climate and energy bill. So let's take it as a climate and energy bill and ask the question, is it even good for our energy security? Is it even good for the environment? Now, I would argue that it is not, because fundamentally this bill took a bunch of taxpayer money, about $257 billion to be exact, and invested it in intermittent energy sources, solar and wind to be exact. Now, these are known to increase the price of electricity on whatever grid they are prevalent, whether that's in California or Germany, while also causing grid disruptions because of their intermittency. And even if we decided that that's what we really wanted, you probably still can't accomplish what you want to accomplish because of the sheer physical challenges that you face. So under the rosiest of scenarios, where there's, let's imagine this world, no bureaucratic red tape, no litigation, no weaponizing of the court system, and a well-functioning permitting system, we might get 155 gigawatts of new energy capacity brought online by 2030. That's estimates from optimistic left-leaning sources. So in this best scenario, you'd get an extra 25% in total capacity for the United States. But you got to remember, when you're talking solar and wind in particular, you can't just talk capacity. You've got to talk actual energy production, which is usually only 30% of capacity. So that number gets reduced again, and eventually we realize we're really only adding 10% additional electricity production under the rosiest of scenarios and at quite a great cost. And so what is the cost? Well, it's not just the $250 billion plus in taxpayer money. It's not just the increases in electricity costs to the consumer, but there's also an environmental cost in terms of land and materials that are required to build these new sources of energy. Because to get to the power capacity of wind that Democrats are hoping for, you need wind turbines covering the entire state of Maryland, about 12,000 square miles. I'm not sure that's good for the environment. It's not just about space. It's that to save the environment, you've got to herd it first. You've got to dig up a lot of materials. And to build 100 megawatt wind farm, you need 30,000 tons of iron ore, 50,000 tons of concrete, 900 tons of non-recyclable plastics. Multiply all that by 850 to get to the 85 gigawatts needed, and you get 25 million tons of iron ore, which means doubling the mining at our 5 largest iron ore mines in America. It's also 52 million tons of concrete, and that's enough concrete for 3 million new homes, or more than enough concrete to finish the remaining hundreds of miles of the I-69 highway that will drive economic benefit for the entire country. And of course, it's 765,000 tons of plastic, which require a drastic increase in oil and gas production. And finally, it reduces property values by 7 to 12%. It'll kill wildlife like the golden eagle and hurt agricultural production. And that's not to say I'm opposed to wind and solar at all. I'm not opposed to using our natural resources to get ourselves energy, but throughout history, energy has been about getting more energy with less resources by utilizing energy-dense materials, more energy for less costs, and more energy with fewer air pollutants. But these trade-offs, just to get 10% of our total production, are simply not worth it. And as policymakers, we have to be looking at the cost-benefit analysis and what we're doing and what will actually yield us the results that we want. And I think this bill will fail to do that. I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today, especially how these clean, cost-saving technologies will benefit consumers, businesses, workers. The American people give us a competitive edge against other countries across the planet. The Inflation Reduction Act is a tremendous step forward. It was recently described by the head of the International Energy Agency as the single most important action in addressing climate change since all of the countries on the planet came together to tackle the crisis. But we know there's more to do, and it's on all of us now to work with the Biden administration, work in our own hometowns to fulfill this big climate deal. Together, we can keep forging this path towards energy independence, harness the immense potential of American clean energy, and I know that American ingenuity will help get us there. So thank you very much. We will make sure that your testimony is included in the record. Without objection, all members have 10 business days within which to submit additional written questions for witnesses, and I ask you to please respond quickly if you're able. Thank you all very much. We are adjourned.